May 1945. The war had ended, but silence still ruled the camps of Western Europe. Morning mist rolled through the wire fences of a temporary American compound near Rheims, France. Inside, rows of young German women stood in faded Wehrmacht uniforms, the wool heavy with rain and defeat. Their boots sank into the muddy ground, hands trembling around tin cups still warm from the coffee an American sergeant had just poured. No one spoke. Only the sound of boots pacing between tents, the hum of diesel trucks, and a distant church bell. The women had been taught to expect hatred, humiliation, vengeance. But instead the guards nodded politely, offering bread, blankets, even a quiet, "Good morning." Some of the women stared, uncomprehending. Others looked down, ashamed of how alien kindness could feel. For the first time in years, no one barked orders. No one shouted their worth or their guilt. And somewhere between disbelief and relief, a truth began to form, that the enemy could be human too. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a broken nation staggering toward collapse. Allied bombers had reduced its cities to skeletons of stone and smoke. Roads were choked with refugees, soldiers, and abandoned wagons. In the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly through Silesia and Pomerania, while in the west, American and British divisions pushed over the Rhine, dismantling what was left of the Wehrmacht's resistance. But hidden among the collapsing front lines was a quieter, less told story: the surrender of women in uniform. Throughout the war, more than 500,000 German women had served in auxiliary military roles: clerks, radio operators, nurses, secretaries, and anti-aircraft helpers. They were members of the Wehrmacht Helferinnen Corps, the female auxiliary corps, bound by duty, propaganda, and often fear. In the final months, many were stationed near communication hubs, airfields, or hospitals, trying to keep order as the Reich fell apart around them. When the Allied armies surged into Western Germany, these women became part of the chaos. Some were captured while tending to the wounded. Others surrendered voluntarily, exhausted, their uniforms threadbare, their illusions shattered. They had been told for years that Allied soldiers, especially Americans, were brutal and vengeful. Leaflets and Nazi broadcasts warned them of defilement and disgrace. But the reality was different. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the United States had clear rules for the treatment of prisoners of war, including women, a rarity in itself. American command understood that these captives were not combatants in the traditional sense. Still, they were treated as POWs under military law, registered, processed, and assigned to temporary enclosures or camps. Most of these camps were makeshift, fenced fields, barracks or abandoned Luftwaffe bases converted almost overnight to hold thousands of prisoners. Near Rheims, Chartres, and Cherbourg, rows of tents filled with German soldiers and a smaller but growing number of women. The U.S. Army's military police, often unprepared for female prisoners, adapted as best they could. They segregated compounds by gender, issued blankets, and recorded each prisoner's name and rank with bureaucratic precision. Conditions were harsh, but not deliberately cruel. Food was simple: tinned meat, bread, coffee. Water was rationed, medical care limited, and overcrowding common. But compared to the eastern camps, these were places of relative order. Even so, fear hung in the air thicker than smoke. The women whispered to each other at night, "What will they do to us?" expecting revenge for the bombings, for the atrocities they had never committed but felt somehow tied to. Some tried to hide insignia or burn letters from home, fearing they might be used against them. Others broke down during interrogation, not from torture, but from shame. The Americans, for their part, were often uneasy too. Many had never seen German women in uniform. To them, these were the faces of the enemy, yet young, weary, and defeated. It blurred the moral lines of war. Small gestures began to pierce that wall of suspicion. A guard handing out cigarettes, a medic treating an infected wound, an officer reminding his men, "They're prisoners, not trophies." It wasn't compassion born from sympathy. It was discipline, policy, and perhaps a quiet understanding that the war's victory meant little if it corrupted their humanity. For the women, the first shock came not from violence, but from its absence. They were spoken to respectfully, counted, not cursed, allowed to write their families. It was a subtle dismantling of everything they had been told about the enemy. And in those first uncertain days inside barbed wire, the greatest transformation had already begun. Not political, not military, but moral. By mid-1945, the United States found itself overseeing one of the largest populations of prisoners of war in modern history, nearly 5 million Axis soldiers across Europe. Among them were tens of thousands of women, clerks from signal battalions, Luftwaffe assistants, Red Cross nurses, and civilian auxiliaries swept up in mass surrenders. For the American command, this was unfamiliar ground. No manual truly prepared them for female enemies. The Wehrmachthelferinnen had never been a major category in pre-war planning, and yet now, in camps scattered from France to Bavaria, their presence demanded both discipline and empathy. American policy toward POWs stemmed from the Geneva Convention of 1929, reinforced by directives from General Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters. Prisoners were to receive humane treatment, food, shelter, medical care, equal as far as possible to that given to U.S. troops. The rules were clear, the practice more complex. In devastated post-war Europe, supplies were strained, and temporary enclosures were improvised from anything available. Open fields, dismantled Luftwaffe airstrips, even sections of old rail yards fenced with barbed wire. The Rheinwiesenlager along the Rhine became infamous for its scale and austerity, though American camps west of the river generally fared better than those closer to combat zones. Inside these compounds, the women quickly noticed something remarkable. Unlike in Soviet custody, where vengeance and survival often replaced law, or in British-run camps, where routine could feel coldly bureaucratic, the Americans displayed a peculiar mixture of order and informality. Guards might offer a smile. Chaplains sometimes held open-air services for any faith. Newspapers were circulated. Educational programs appeared within months. It was civilization, reasserting itself through discipline. Reports from the time described the pragmatic professionalism of the American Guards. Many were young, scarcely older than the women they watched. A corporal from Kansas wrote home, "They look tired, not dangerous. We feed them same as us." That attitude, multiplied across hundreds of camps, created an atmosphere that confused and disarmed the prisoners. For the women who had grown up on Nazi propaganda portraying Americans as barbaric or racially degenerate, each polite exchange undermined a lifetime of indoctrination. Cultural encounters multiplied. Nurses compared medical methods with U.S. medics. Interpreters from both sides taught each other phrases. When one American cook discovered that the German women could bake bread, he quietly arranged flour for them, a gesture that, in the hunger of 1945, felt almost sacred. Within weeks, some camps saw informal cooperation. Germans helping with cleaning, tending gardens, organizing makeshift concerts. The Americans, bound by regulations but moved by humanity, allowed small freedoms that carried enormous emotional weight. Permission to sing, to write home, to retain personal belongings. The moral contrast was profound. To the women, this restraint was incomprehensible. They had watched the Reich collapse under total war, seen executions, and believed that mercy had vanished from the world. Yet here, inside fences meant to hold enemies, they discovered a strange equality. It wasn't friendship, it was recognition. Still, not everything was gentle. The camps struggled with shortages and overcrowding. Deaths from exposure or malnutrition did occur in harsher conditions. But even amid those hardships, the U.S. command investigated abuses, replaced officers, and documented complaints, something unheard of in most other systems. The act of being heard itself began to redefine what captivity meant. By late summer, as Europe began to rebuild, the tone of captivity shifted. Interrogations gave way to administration. Fear gave way to boredom. And within that stillness, reflection began. The German women started to ask themselves questions that had once been forbidden. What had they believed in? What had they served? Why had their enemies shown restraint? The Americans, in turn, saw in these prisoners a chance, however small, to demonstrate the moral victory behind the military one. Humane treatment wasn't weakness. It was proof of civilization enduring after chaos. And so, through thousands of quiet gestures, a shared cigarette, a word of respect, a letter safely mailed, a fragile bridge formed between conqueror and captive. That bridge would soon shape something greater. The rehumanization of a defeated people, one small act of decency at a time. For the captured women, surrender was not just the loss of a war. It was the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. They had lived through years of slogans and broadcasts that dehumanized the enemy, painting Americans as invaders who would enslave and violate them. Yet, as they were herded into compounds, they found no cruelty waiting. Many recalled the first night vividly. Tents pitched on wet ground, the flicker of lanterns, the smell of ration stew drifting from the guards' camp. The Americans spoke in short, careful English, sometimes through interpreters. They followed procedure, recorded each woman's name, rank, and service role, then handed her a tin of food and a blanket. For some, that moment broke them. Women who had braced for assault found themselves shaking not from fear, but from confusion. One former radio operator later wrote in her memoir, "I could not understand why they did not hate us. They had every reason." It was a reversal of power without humiliation. And for many of these young women, raised in a world of rigid hierarchy and obedience, that sense of being treated as equals, even behind barbed wire, was disorienting in ways no weapon could inflict. American soldiers in 1945 were not philosophers. Most were farm boys, factory workers, or students who had crossed an ocean to end tyranny. They had seen their comrades die in Normandy, Ardennes, and the Ruhr. They had reason to hate. But the U.S. Army's moral structure, built on military law, chaplain guidance, and the Geneva Convention, demanded restraint. In briefings, guards were reminded, they are prisoners, not enemies anymore. For many, that idea carried unexpected weight. It forced young Americans to distinguish between justice and revenge. Historians later noted that Eisenhower's command insisted on discipline as a moral weapon. America's victory, they believed, would mean nothing if it descended into the brutality it had fought against. The treatment of German POWs, especially women, became an unspoken test of that principle, and so the camps became unlikely classrooms of ethics. A corporal might refuse to confiscate a prisoner's keepsake because she earned that through her own duty. A lieutenant might intervene when a guard shouted too harshly, not because of pity, but because of principle. For the prisoners, this was the most bewildering punishment of all, to face an enemy who would not become a monster. The war had not just destroyed buildings, it had shattered belief systems. For 12 years, these women had lived under a doctrine that preached the superiority of their nation, race, and cause. Even those who never fully believed it had absorbed its logic through repetition. Americans were supposed to be inferior, lazy, materialistic, chaotic. And yet, as the weeks passed inside the camp, reality inverted that myth. The Americans' discipline was steady but not cruel. Their command was firm but not absolute. They joked with each other, shared cigarettes, and treated their prisoners with a casual confidence that suggested moral strength, not arrogance. Some German women noticed the racial diversity among the guards: Italian Americans, Polish Americans, black soldiers, and were stunned to see them treated equally within the U.S. ranks. It defied everything Nazi propaganda had insisted was impossible. Every meal served, every letter delivered, became a small blow against the ideology that had fueled the war. Equality, they realized, was not weakness. It was the Americans' greatest weapon. By late summer 1945, a strange rhythm had settled over the camps. The women washed their clothes in cold water buckets. American guards rotated shifts, sometimes sharing music from a portable radio. At night, the low hum of distant laughter mixed with the sound of the wind through canvas tents. They were still captives, but the war had finally ended inside them. Each day without cruelty became proof that something larger had survived the ruins, a moral order that the Third Reich could not destroy. And though they didn't yet realize it, that quiet dignity would outlast the fences. Inside the camps, the greatest battle was fought not with weapons, but with memory. The German women had arrived believing that captivity meant humiliation. The propaganda they had grown up with, radio speeches, newsreels, whispered warnings, had painted Americans as moral degenerates, drunk on violence and greed. But each passing day inside the fences dissolved another piece of that fiction. When an American medic cleaned a prisoner's wound without anger, when a guard offered aspirin instead of punishment, when a chaplain allowed them to pray freely, these moments struck deeper than any interrogation. The women began to question everything they had once accepted as truth. Some wrote in secret journals. One entry from a captured Luftwaffe assistant found after the war read simply, "We feared monsters. Instead, they are men, and they seem tired like us." This quiet recognition spread through the camps like an unseen current. It wasn't gratitude at first. It was confusion, even guilt. The realization that they, who had supported or served a regime of hate, were now treated with decency by those they had been taught to despise, tore at their identities. For many, that confrontation was harder to bear than defeat. It forced them to see that humanity existed on both sides, and that ideology had blinded them to it. The American command structure treated moral order not as a luxury, but as a weapon of civilization. Behind the scenes, officers in charge of POW administration, men like General B.Q. Jones and Colonel Robert W. Comer, circulated memoranda reminding units that the United States is judged by its treatment of prisoners. The message was clear. The world was watching. Americans. Commanders knew that mistreating captives would stain the very victory they had fought to secure. So they enforced order through consistency. Every camp had a chain of responsibility. Prisoners were counted, registered, and given access to limited correspondence. Complaints, when made, were documented. Inspections were frequent, even when resources were scarce. What emerged was not luxury, but predictability, the foundation of psychological safety. To a prisoner who had lived through years of chaos, that predictability was transformative. The women learned that rules could exist without terror, that authority could coexist with fairness. For the American soldiers, too, it was a moral exercise. Treating an enemy decently after such a brutal war required restraint. Chaplains held small services reminding troops of their oath, while some commanding officers quoted Abraham Lincoln's words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." The system wasn't perfect, but it was disciplined. And in that discipline lay the quiet triumph of democracy over dictatorship. It was often the smallest moments that left the deepest mark. On July 4, 1945, in one camp near Rheims, American soldiers celebrated Independence Day. Instead of excluding the prisoners, they invited them to listen. A band played swing tunes under a flag fluttering in the summer wind. Some guards even passed along slices of cake and ice cream, a gesture almost unthinkable to those who had once worn German uniforms. Many of the women wept. They had expected punishment. They found music. They had expected hatred. They found a strange equality. To be allowed, even for a moment, to share in the rhythm of freedom. Elsewhere, chaplains organized Christmas services where prisoners were permitted to sing hymns in German. The song Stille Nacht, Silent Night, floated across barbed wire, joined by the soft hum of American voices. For a brief time, the dividing line between victor and vanquished blurred into something human. These were not political gestures. They were emotional surrenders. They symbolized that civilization had survived the barbarism of total war. One female POW later wrote, "They treated us not as women of the enemy, but as women of the world. For the first time, I understood what equality meant." Each act, a shared coffee, a returned photograph, a respectful nod, became a quiet assertion of values. To the Americans, it was discipline. To the Germans, it was revelation. And though none of them knew it then, these brief, humane encounters were planting the first fragile seeds of the reconciliation that would one day rebuild Europe. By the end of 1945, thousands of these women would be transferred, repatriated, or integrated into work details. Yet for many, the memory that endured was not the fences or the rations, but the paradox of being treated like equals in defeat. What began as captivity was turning into awakening. July 4th, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for nearly 2 months, but for those behind the wire, peace still felt like a rumor. At dawn, the sky over Rheims glowed faintly pink. Inside the American POW compound, German women stirred from their tents, wrapping shawls over their uniforms. It was another day of routine. Roll call, rations, silence. But this morning felt different. The air carried a kind of expectancy. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, the sound of a band was warming up. Trumpets, drums, laughter. The women exchanged puzzled looks. An American corporal, young and sunburned, passed by the fence, whistling something cheerful. Then, at precisely 900 hours, the compound loudspeakers crackled to life. Attention all personnel. Today is Independence Day. To the prisoners, the words meant little, but to the Americans, it was sacred. The day they celebrated freedom. The very idea that had driven them across oceans and into battlefields. Instead of isolating the prisoners, the camp commandant made a quiet decision. The German women would be allowed to watch, not as participants, not as equals, but as witnesses. And so they gathered near the wire, cautious, curious, shielding their eyes from the morning glare as the Americans formed ranks in the open field. A small flag rose slowly against the sky. The band played the Star-Spangled Banner. The sound drifted across the camp, a sound both proud and melancholy, echoing through the ruins of a continent. At first the German women stood still. Some lowered their heads, unsure whether to show respect. Others watched with silent intensity, as if trying to understand the meaning of the melody. Then something unexpected happened. When the anthem ended, the American soldiers didn't cheer or boast. They turned toward the fence, and one of them, a lieutenant from Ohio, gave a small, polite salute. It was not triumph. It was acknowledgement. Moments later, the band shifted tunes. The rhythm lightened. Boogie-woogie bugle boy. Laughter broke out. A few soldiers danced awkwardly in the grass. Someone rolled a barrel forward, filled with lemonade and ice cream, luxuries rare even among victors. And in a gesture that no one could have anticipated, the guards began handing out small paper cups through the wire. For a moment, time stopped. The German women hesitated. Then one stepped forward. A nurse named Helene, barely 20. She took the cup with trembling hands. The American smiled and said only one word: peace. Others followed. The women sipped cautiously, the cold sweetness almost shocking after months of hardship. Some began to cry, quietly, ashamed of their tears. Others simply stared at the Americans, as though they were seeing them for the first time. It wasn't the ice cream that moved them. It was what it represented: an act without demand, a kindness without agenda. The lieutenant who organized the event later wrote in his report, "We thought it might remind them that mercy wins wars as surely as firepower." Throughout the afternoon, the music continued: jazz, hymns, marches. The German women stood at the fence, their faces softened by a rare lightness. A few began to hum along, hesitant at first, then louder. When a sergeant recognized the melody of Silent Night, he motioned for the band to play it. And as the familiar notes rose into the warm July air, American and German voices blended together. No speeches were made. No photographs were taken. But those who were there later spoke of it as the moment the war truly ended for them. Because freedom, they realized, could exist even behind barbed wire, not in the absence of control, but in the presence of dignity. That day became legend in the camp, retold quietly for years after repatriation. Some called it the day the enemy smiled. Others remembered only the music and the taste of something sweet after years of bitterness, It was a small celebration in a forgotten corner of a ruined continent, yet it symbolized everything the war had been fought for, and, for those women, it shattered the last illusion left by the Reich, that strength required cruelty. The celebration ended hours before sunset, but its echo lingered long after the band had packed their instruments and the guards had returned to duty. The women in the camp sat silently, their cups still in hand, as if afraid that moving would shatter the fragile sense of peace that had entered the air. For the first time, they had witnessed the Americans not as conquerors or symbols of propaganda, but as human beings celebrating an ideal, freedom, that until now had been only a word in enemy broadcasts. That day did something no lecture or interrogation could have done. It humanized victory. In the days that followed, something subtle changed inside the camp. The women began speaking more freely with the guards. Some asked about America, what it looked like, how life there was after the war. Others volunteered to help with camp chores, cooking, cleaning, even repairing uniforms. The tone shifted from resignation to quiet curiosity. An American corporal, in a letter to his fiancée back home, described it this way: "They stopped being shadows. Now they look us in the eyes." Small details told the story better than any report could. Prisoners began greeting guards with a cautious, "Good morning." Women who had once avoided direct gaze now asked questions about music, language, and families. And when a young American guard mentioned his mother sending cookies from Kansas, the camp's senior nurse offered to bake bread for him in return. It was no longer a world divided between victors and vanquished. It was a fragile truce between equals, shaped not by treaties but by empathy. The transformation did not come from speeches. It came from behavior, from soldiers who lived their values instead of proclaiming them. Behind this new atmosphere was a deliberate moral policy. American military authorities understood that post-war victory depended not only on territory, but on conscience. If the next generation of Germans was to embrace democracy, it would not be through punishment alone. It would come through exposure to fairness, decency, and the everyday civility that totalitarianism had erased. So officers were instructed, quietly but consistently, to demonstrate the values of the United States through conduct. One directive circulated among camp leaders read, "The most effective propaganda is justice." They didn't lecture about democracy. They modeled it. Meals were distributed equally. Complaints were heard and logged. Religious freedom was respected. When a pregnant German nurse went into labor, the camp doctor, a veteran of the Normandy landings, personally ensured her care. When she delivered a healthy baby girl, the guards stood outside the infirmary, hats off, listening as the child's first cries filled the camp. That moment, one American officer later recalled, felt like the first real sound of peace. The compassion was not one-sided. Many U.S. soldiers had arrived in Europe hardened by years of combat. They had seen atrocities in concentration camps, witnessed the destruction of towns, and lost friends. To them, Germans were the architects of suffering. But the sight of weary young women, many barely out of adolescence, struggling to rebuild dignity, stirred something unexpected: empathy. It was easy to hate an army. It was harder to hate a face that looked tired, human, and afraid. Some soldiers later admitted that the experience reshaped their understanding of what they'd fought for. One sergeant wrote in his diary, "It's strange. We came here to destroy the evil they served, but now we're showing them what good looks like." And that realization, that decency could be a weapon stronger than vengeance, left a mark on both sides. For the women, the realization was devastating in its clarity. They had spent their youth serving a state that glorified power and despised compassion. Yet their enemies, whom they'd been told were inferior, had shown them mercy and restraint. It forced a reckoning, not of nationality, but of humanity. As one former Luftwaffe secretary later told a historian, "I had been proud to serve Germany, but that day I saw what true strength meant. It was not shouting. It was self-control." These revelations would travel far beyond the camp fences. Many of these women later returned home, carrying with them stories of decency that contradicted the Nazi myth of American barbarity. Their testimonies became quiet seeds of reconciliation in the fragile soil of post-war Germany. As summer faded into autumn, the barbed wire remained, but its meaning changed. It no longer represented fear. It represented structure. Within those boundaries, the women found the first outlines of a new identity, one built not on superiority, but on equality. They had been defeated as soldiers, but as human beings they were being rebuilt. And in that strange inversion, the Americans had achieved something that weapons never could. They had conquered without cruelty. Autumn 1945. The leaves along the French countryside were beginning to turn when the first groups of German prisoners received word of their release. Their paperwork was stamped with the word Entlassung, discharge. For many of the women, it felt unreal. They had arrived in the camps expecting punishment. Now, months later, they were walking out with rations, medical clearance, and, in some cases, handwritten notes from their American guards wishing them luck. Freedom, after captivity, felt almost heavier than defeat. The roads leading east were crowded. Civilians, ex-soldiers, Red Cross convoys, all moving toward a homeland they no longer recognized. The women carried what little they owned: a blanket, a tin cup, a letter, sometimes a gift, a comb, a bar of soap, a photograph of the camp orchestra. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, something deeper had taken root. They had entered captivity as instruments of a fallen ideology. They left as witnesses to another kind of strength, one that had treated them, even in their lowest hour, as equals. Historians later found that many of these women spoke of their American captors with a tone of disbelief. Some called them men of rules. Others, more simply, decent. One former POW nurse told an interviewer in 1947, "They did not treat us as Germans. They treated us as people. It made me ashamed, but it also made me hope." When these women returned to Germany, they became unexpected messengers of a moral contrast. In the ruins of Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Munich, they told neighbors that the Americans had not sought revenge, that the guards had shared food, allowed hymns, and even protected them from harassment. At first, few believed them. The narrative of Allied cruelty had been too deeply embedded in wartime propaganda. But as more prisoners came home, their accounts aligned. Slowly, a different story began to take shape. One where the victors had shown restraint and fairness even in triumph. That story mattered, because in a Germany suffocating under guilt and ruin, it offered something rare, a glimpse of moral balance. It proved that dignity was still possible, even after catastrophe. The American authorities, though pragmatic, understood the psychological value of these experiences. They encouraged post-war outreach programs where former prisoners could correspond with American families or relief organizations. Some of the women volunteered to translate or assist in rebuilding hospitals under Allied supervision. The tone was no longer one of punishment, but of participation, the beginning of what would later become the German-American Partnership in Reconstruction. These human connections, born in captivity, quietly reinforced a political transformation. The Marshall Plan, years later, would rebuild the physical Europe that war had destroyed. But the emotional groundwork for that trust had been laid earlier, inside camps where humanity had survived the wreckage. Many of the women carried a private burden: the question of guilt. They had served the Reich, directly or indirectly. Some had typed orders, others patched soldiers who would return to the front. But they had also seen, in captivity, the moral difference between obedience and justice. That realization haunted some, liberated others. In post-war diaries, a recurring phrase appeared: "They treated us better than we treated our own." That confession was both painful and purifying. It marked the first step in the long internal process of Germany's moral reawakening, a reckoning that would take generations. By the time winter came, most of the women had vanished back into civilian life. Some never spoke of the camps again. Others wrote letters to the Americans who had guarded them. Letters that often began not with apology, but with gratitude. The war was over. The fences were gone. But the lesson endured. That equality was not something granted by victory. It was proven by restraint. By 1946, most of the female prisoners held in American custody had been repatriated. Their uniforms were gone, their service records sealed, their lives folded back into the fabric of a broken Germany. Yet, what they carried with them could not be confiscated. The experience of having been treated like equals when they least deserved it. Historians later called this the silent reconstruction, the rebuilding of values before the rebuilding of cities. When these women rejoined their families, their stories contradicted every myth that the Third Reich had burned into German consciousness. The enemy, they said, had shown mercy, the occupier had shown order, and the victor had shown restraint. It was not propaganda that softened Germany's hatred. It was memory. American policymakers in Europe soon recognized the influence of these first-hand accounts. They realized that their soldiers' behavior, often instinctive and moral rather than strategic, had become one of the most powerful tools of democratization. Every story of fairness that reached a ruined village became quiet proof that democracy did not mean chaos, and that justice could exist without fear. The U.S. military government began to institutionalize that approach. Educational programs emphasized ethical governance, civic responsibility, and women's participation in Reconstruction, ideas that echoed the very respect the POWs had experienced in captivity. What had begun as a policy of humane treatment evolved into a cultural doctrine. Rebuild not through domination, but through example. In countless small ways, it worked. When West Germany eventually re-entered the global community, much of its moral vocabulary, freedom, equality, rule of law, reflected the principles its defeated citizens had first encountered through their captors. For the former prisoners, those months behind the wire remained among the most vivid of their lives. In interviews decades later, they spoke not of deprivation or fear, but of realization. One woman, who had served as a signals clerk near Koblenz, said, "I expected hate. Instead, they taught me manners again. Simple things, to say thank you, to share, to wait my turn." Such lessons sound trivial in peace, but after years of war, they were revolutionary. These small restorations of civility became the foundation of a different Germany, one that would rebuild not only its cities, but its conscience. And for the Americans who served as guards, medics, and officers, the memory lingered as well. Many later admitted that it changed their view of justice and of themselves. One lieutenant reflected in a 1960 veterans interview, "We were trained to fight for freedom, but it was in guarding prisoners that I understood what freedom actually looked like." By the early 1950s, the world had changed again. A new enemy, communism, was rising in the East, and former foes were becoming allies. When the United States began to build its Cold War alliances, it turned naturally to West Germany, not as a conquered territory, but as a partner. Trust, once unthinkable, had already been tested. Not in treaties, but in tents and barbed wire enclosures, where American soldiers had proven the strength of democracy through decency. The same young German women who had stood silently in those camps later became teachers, nurses, administrators, many of them working directly with American officials during Reconstruction. Their memories of fairness guided how they approached the new order. They knew firsthand that equality could heal more deeply than punishment. By the time the decade closed, the world had largely forgotten the small American camps that had once dotted France and Germany. They were overshadowed by grander narratives: Nuremberg, the Marshall Plan, NATO. Yet beneath those milestones lay a quieter truth, that the moral tone of post-war Europe had been set not in conference rooms, but in places where compassion triumphed over vengeance. The treatment of those women, so ordinary, so unsung, had demonstrated that civilization survives only when mercy is stronger than victory. And though few monuments would ever mark those camps, their legacy endured in every handshake, every treaty, every alliance built on respect rather than fear. For a generation raised in dictatorship, equality had not been taught in schools or preached by leaders. It had been shown, by American soldiers who understood that how one treats the defeated defines the kind of peace that follows. The fences are gone now. The fields where the camps once stood have returned to silence, grass reclaiming the earth, the wind moving softly over forgotten ground. No monuments stand for the women who waited there or for the soldiers who guarded them. And yet something of that time endures, not in stone, but in memory. In those small enclosures of wire and fear, civilization proved it could survive its own destruction. The Americans who guarded those women did not win the war by cruelty, but by its opposite. They showed that justice could be firm without hatred, that power could be wielded without humiliation. For the German women who stood behind the fences, that lesson cut deeper than defeat itself. It was the moment they learned that equality was not a word carved into constitutions. It was a choice made in the smallest human acts. The war had ended through force, but peace began through restraint. History often remembers battles, the tanks, the air raids, the flags raised over ruins. Yet the quieter victories matter more. A cup of coffee passed through barbed wire, a song sung in 2 languages, a day when enemies shared ice cream instead of gunfire. These were not grand gestures, but they carried a weight that no weapon could match. They showed that mercy was not weakness. It was endurance. And from those moments, the fragile trust that rebuilt a continent began to grow. The narrator's voice softens. We see the last image. An empty field at dawn, a single piece of rusted wire glinting in the light. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings. Faint, hopeful, eternal. In war, we learn how to destroy, the voice says. In peace, we learn how to remain human. Fade to black. The story of the German POW women ends not with surrender, but with understanding that the greatest victory is not domination, but dignity.